what do you both make of this whistleblower, which we're hearing quite a bit about this morning, the evidence that he gave to the Foreign Affairs Committee, the written evidence? This guy who's 25, working in the Foreign Office during the Afghan evacuation. He lays out quite a bleak list of charges as to how it was handled. Danny, what for you stuck out as being particularly worrisome?
Well, I haven't had a chance to read the whole thing. I should say that to start off with. Secondly, it's obviously only one person's account, and one should always be cautious about that. Nevertheless, the bits that I have read are really very concerning. I suppose the most obvious one of those is the story about the animals and pen farthing, which I know he has rebutted vociferously. He's not a person that I oppose, whose judgment I repose a lot of faith in. But the truth is that story is pretty shocking because and we all sort of know that politics does work occasionally like that, where the sort of colourful story pushes out the more strategically important things to do. It's just very shocking when you read that has happened in such a direct way. And it did look, to my mind, it did look fairly convincing. But, it's very important to say you often learn more when you understand the perspective of more than one person. The way that I put it with these things is, if when you read something, it looks incredible, how could someone possibly have done that? Usually the person who did it has some argument as to why they did it. Yeah. So to them, it didn't look so stupid. So you have to take both those into account. So I'd want to see that. I'd want to see what the rebuttal was. But that did look pretty shocking.
But it's interesting, isn't it? That there is a divide in terms of the accusations, David. In that there's the politics and him criticising what he called slow decision making by the Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab. But then there's just things like how government physically works, i.e. the Foreign Office not providing enough passwords to the computers, so the soldiers they brought in to help with the admin, 8 of them had to share one computer because they couldn't log into enough of them.
Yeah, like Danny, it takes some time to digest it all. And again, like Danny, you have to make the caveats, which is it could be what one person sees at a particular time, and maybe they don't see the bigger picture and so on. The other thing to say is the animals trade-off we knew pretty quickly after it had happened. So that's not actually news. And it is a kind of, but it is an indicator of how politics and an emergency situation can mix badly. I thought that his descriptions, but on the other hand, he comes to something fairly fresh, and he comes to it without excuses and so on, which allows him to make perceptions which are, if you like, what an outsider would see, and that's quite valuable in itself because the outsider doesn't normally get a chance to see. One of the things he describes in terms of the way in which Dominic Raab appears to have worked is the kind of classic example of, if you like, the not absolutely competent control freak. And we've all met these people and so on, with the people who simultaneously demand to be informed about absolutely everything and across absolutely everything, but not actually that good at making decisions. So what happens is that the whole business slows up, and then when actually a decision gets made, it's not always the right one. The bigger and background picture, though, I think is this. It was said, I mean, because some of us said it right the way back in April, that the combination of two presidents' policies towards Afghanistan were quite likely going to lead to a situation of disaster in Afghanistan, and that would mean masses of people trying to get out. And we really don't. So there should have been something that kicked in at the moment when that began to happen, even if it was happening earlier than people had anticipated it, because we knew it was one of the big possibilities. And I can't discern in all this the outline of how that plan, if you like, was war gamed before this actual situation arose. You can't see it.
Can you?
No,
Danny?
No, I think that's correct. Because the danger with very vivid, witness statements from the sort of scene is that you miss what David calls the strategic picture, which is how this happened in the first place, how we ended up having to rush this in the first place. And those all need to be taken into account as well. I don't think, by the way, they'll be at scalpatory. They'll add to the problem. So I think, this evidence did look very vivid and very important, and it did seem to show quite serious failings. So I think we should be grateful to him for doing it. But we do need to subject ourselves, we do need to subject to the normal critical scrutiny.
Yes. And I should say that Dominic Raab has been on the airwaves this morning. He's called that list of charges, quote, frankly, a mischaracterization of the pressures. He also says not enough recognition has been given to how hard the mission was, but he has admitted that lessons can be learned. Let's move on to something that's also quite worrying, that the situation surrounding Ukraine. We know overnight Boris Johnson held talks with Biden and also leaders from Germany, France and Italy, trying to put on this united front ahead of Biden's call with Putin a little bit later on. David, this has been described, well, the New York Times characterised it as being, sort of Ukraine's independence as a free nation is potentially hanging in the balance with this phone call.
I find it hard to believe that even Vladimir Putin is going to invade Ukraine. I mean, I really do. It's such an incredible. I mean, of course, people will say, well, he seized Crimea, annexed it, and so on. But there is, believe it or not, a significant difference between that. I mean, you can say one could lead to the other, but there is a significant difference between them. Ukraine is an active ally of ours. It might not be in NATO. We act as guarantors of its territorial integrity. Although we are not going to go to war with Putin, act of proper war with Putin about Ukraine, because that is not, although, if the situation escalated, and this is one of the things that Putin has to bear in mind, we could find ourselves in a very, very serious and potentially armed situation down the road, which is one of the reasons why I think he won't do that. But everything short of actually getting troops involved would be done to help protect the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and that is the only message that Western governments can afford to put out. In other words, you have to put out the strongest message you possibly can. Don't go down this path. You will regret it. And if Putin does invade Ukraine, we will all regret it, but he will regret it, and the Russians will regret it more than anybody else.
And Danny, what of the US position on this? Because, of course, the US side was at pains in the briefings last night to say militaristic options are not firmly not on the table with this. They were stressing, Iranian-style sanctions on banks and pulling Russia out of the international financial settlement systems and things like that. But as David was referring to there, boots on the ground was not even being entertained.
No, I wish I could be as confident as you are, David, that he won't invade, because I think that there are quite a lot of indications that he will. He definitely does consider Ukraine to be part of Russia and not an independent nation. He's given long, quite tedious lectures going back to the 1300s and the 1100s. And funny enough, just as this story is happening, I'm writing the book about my parents, and I was literally just writing about the Russian invasion of Lvov in 1939. And Russia did that because it was going to defend its fellow citizens in Western Ukraine. That was the excuse they gave. And they definitely do think it's sort of not just part of their sphere of interest, but part of their country. And so I think that Putin could persuade himself he wasn't really invading, that he was simply, defending the people of Ukraine against their government or some such formulation. It's very serious, and I'm not sure. I think it's enough to say that we're going to impose sanctions, because I think any sign of weakness will encourage him in this act. That having been said, it's unbelievably difficult to know what to do, because, it probably is unrealistic to fight a war over it. But on the other hand, it may be that if we're not willing to do that, he's willing to take over, a country that deserves, the support of Western democracies to be an independent and free nation. So, I'm not saying I've got an answer to that question, but I'm really worried about it.
No, I think you're right. I think you're right to worry. I just add this. Even Putin will be aware that the majority of Ukrainians don't want a Russian takeover of Ukraine. That gives him a very significant problem in and of itself. In other words, there would be and will be a long-term significant resistance, which would act as a very big drain on Russia at a time when it can't really afford such a thing. Well, it never can afford such a thing, really. So my optimism is not based on a kind of, belief that Vladimir Putin is is a nice guy or doesn't have or has a neutral attitude towards Ukraine's sovereignty. He doesn't, but on a much more kind of pragmatic basis, that the situation that he would then create for himself would actually be not only intolerable but incredibly risky. I mean, just incredibly risky long term. It destabilizes the whole of Eastern Europe and Russia's border neighbors and so on, and creates all kinds of potential, which we hardly even speculate about now. But frankly, if you're Finland, if you're Norway, if you're any one of these countries, the Baltic countries, Georgia, right the way down to Moldova, etc., and made it, then in that case, you are in a state effectively of armed alarm. That can't be good.
Let's move on to less intractable matters. Omicron and how to defend ourselves against it. Of course, lots of worry, even just on this programme earlier on, about its spread and what we're learning about it. Rob on the airwaves this morning was saying we're not at Plan B yet. We're not thinking about that. Danny, is he right?
Well, no, he's not right not to think about it,
Yeah.
but I believe it's basically we don't know whether or not this is going to prove sufficiently milder. It looks like it's almost certainly not going to be less mild, but is it going to be milder or sufficiently milder to mean that the rapid rise in cases isn't going to, when combined with the infection and hospitalization rate, going to lead to an overwhelming of hospitals? We just don't know that. The moment we know that, we're going to have to move in one direction or another. There's no point pretending to ourselves that it's not a problem if it's a problem. We just don't know it yet. And I think it's right to, it's very difficult. The problem is if you move now, that has real consequences. People shouldn't just sort of say, blithely, you'd bankrupt businesses, you would, spoil a lot of people's education. That it has real impact. So I think that we're probably striking the right balance, but we certainly ought to be planning for a situation in which this could do what we've tried to avoid the whole time, which is lead to very large numbers of hospitalizations that the system can't cope with. I'm going to hope that that's not the case, and there's a very, it's sort of almost like a coin flip as to whether it is or isn't.
But David, do you think government is too fearful of some of those measures which have become political hot potatoes, thinking about things like vaccine passports and widespread mask mandates? Lots of other countries are doing it. I've just come back from the US, where you couldn't even go into a restaurant and sit down, or anywhere where you just sort of sit for a moment and have a coffee without flashing your vaccine passport or a negative test from the day before. Is government just too fearful of those things because of the sort of toxic nature around the debate of it?
I think we've been a bit slow on those things. In other words, the things that don't cause a dramatic economic or any significant economic collapse, but which people just don't like very much. I think we have been a bit slow on these things. I mean, it was what was marked was, if you use the London Tube as I do, was up until the moment when the government remandated masks on public transport, although they were already mandated in London, you got down to about 60-40 usage, and it went up to about 99% the very next day, which is a better outcome. Well, you've got to ask yourself why you ever let it go in that case, but until we were more through it. And I think there are a number of things like this. I would like to have seen venues much more closely asking to see proof of vaccination status and so on when letting people in than they actually have been. They've been telling people we will examine status, but they never do. And everybody knows they don't, so they don't take any notice. So to kind of get used to some of these things. But I have to say, it's not absolutely clear to me what the vast difference is between the pattern of infection and hospitalization is between countries who have done that and the countries that haven't done that. I mean, there may be some, but it's not clear to me that it's absolutely huge. So I would have just done it in order to get people used to the fact that and feeling that we are still in something, rather than we had somehow magically escaped it, which Omicron comes along and tells us we haven't.
Can I finally ask you both about Panto? We're talking about Panto.
No, you can't.
Okay,
you
well, good to
can't.
talk to you
No.
both. Thanks so much. No, of course, we need to talk about Panto. So we're doing That's Our Big Thing at 11 because Panto is obviously back. It sort of spluttered at a start last year and then was shut down by the tiering system across the country. Are either of you fans? Danny, are you a Panto fan?
As you can imagine, I'm never off the panel. Look, basically, if you've got 3 children, and my oldest one's now 21, but if you've been through the period of having 3 young children, anything that represents a show that is on in the theatre, anything is always good. So I've become fans of any of those things, and they are incredibly professional. But do I enjoy them myself? No. I'm a bit like the combination of Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer in the sense that I've sort of been to Peppa Pig World, if you see what I mean, but I didn't enjoy it.
Present but not involved.
That's using an analogy, by the way. I basically accept that pantos are very good for some people, and I've taken my children to them, but I don't wildly enjoy them.
And David, are you at the other end of the spectrum? Are you already shimming into your dame dress
Well,
and spreading on a load of red lippy?
I've got a question for both you and Danny. Where's the Albanian flag?
The Albanian flag? It's on your
look at my picture.
sofa.
No, it's behind me. Honestly.
Oh.
God almighty.
Albanian flag panto jokes. Let's strike them off the script for next year's panto.
Well, I don't know. I try my best, honestly. I mean,
that was
because
your
I'm. You don't know this, but I'm almost certain I'm very much hoping to be a grandfather for the first time at the end of February. And one of the things I am pretty much looking forward to is getting back into doing those kinds of things that small kids like, while having an excuse to do them myself. And panto would certainly be one of them.
Wonderful. Well, congratulations, and we look forward on your behalf to all your panto outings. Thank you both so much for joining us, Danny Finkelstein and David Aaronovitch. Tip-top Times columnists, of course, available in the paper, on the app and the website as well.